It's good to be back here. Yeah. It's a beautiful weather, actually. The snow is beautiful. It just, as long as it stays off the roads, that'd be a good with me. Sorry I don't have my jacket on. I left it at the hotel. Every once in a while I always forget something. I do something with my dress that's not right. I remember going to Brooklyn one Sabbath, and I have two different sets of pair of black shoes for Sabbath. One's a little bit more round in the front, the other's a little more square. Well, I had one of each. And our head deacon it was an amazing comment. He told me that I had a pair just like it at home. So anyway, no, it's good here to be with you. That coat's a little heavy. And so anyway, I'm pretty comfortable up here. So we're going to be doing something called focusing on intelligent design. And I'm preparing for a seminar in one of the two churches I'm with. And in fact, in February, we're going to have something for the community called Intelligent Design Therapy. A lot of people are dealing with depression, anxiety, pretty sad. People not feeling well, feeling a little sicker than normal, which is happening. Our immune systems are getting weaker from year to year, and there's just a lot more rise in physical maladies as well as emotional, and no doubt spiritual. One of the fastest growing segments of our society is what they call the nones, people who have no affiliation to religion, no certain church or anything like that. And that's a growing segment of our population, actually. So to me, doing my doctorate in counseling, I kind of realized that none of the therapies really focused on God at all. Doesn't mean that they didn't have good principles in them. They should have some. I mean, how could you have a therapy that's no good at all, The problem is that they never introduce God to people. And by not introducing God, the replacement for that is they do a little therapy and then give them a prescription. And the thing is we need to introduce God from the beginning in our therapies. Because ultimately, God is not just creator and redeemer. He's also the great problem solver. And whether people are dealing with things emotionally or psychologically, or God is able to solve problems. When I think of most of the stories in the Bible, when people had problems amongst people, it was because they didn't follow what God asked them to do. It's when we try to be our own problem solver that we tend to make things a little worse than better. And so I just thinking having something in the public that's not ashamed to say there is a creator. Right. And he is involved and he does love you. And if we feel sadder or sicker, it's because we're breaking some laws of life. We're breaking some principles, right? Because God never designed us to die. He never designed us to be sick. We only get sick and we only die because of the violation of principles, the principles of heaven. So through this intelligent design therapy, I'm actually using the word creation as an acronym instead of the word New Start. New Start's a really great name to introduce nutrition, exercise, water, if you're familiar with that. But if you notice it, trust in God's the last thing on that, on New Start. Ends with a T. And it just seems to me there needs to be a way to have God at the beginning. And New Start's a great program, but even that is a little bit more focused on the physical than on the emotional or the spiritual. And somehow we need to at least have an alternative that focuses on the spiritual and then the mental and then the physical, you see. And I think it's just an appropriate approach. And so as you see here, the C would be communion with the Creator, which will be our next message. And then this afternoon we'll talk about relationships, the R. E for exercise, A for attitudes, are people more positive, negative, they generalize a lot. There's just a lot that goes on with our attitudes. And a lot of our attitudes is something that we've inherited. And we'll talk this time about that, but it's just that we inherit a lot more than we know. And you can inherit fear. You don't just inherit eye color or the kind of hair you have, or hair color, or your height, you can actually inherit fear and other kinds of things. And they've done quite a bit of experiments with, for example, so like with mice. They had a group of mice, and they would have this cherry blossom scent, and every time they smelled it, they'd get electrical shock. And then they, in the next generation, which never had the electrical shock, and the generations after that, when they smelled the orange blossom scent, they all had fear. Isn't that interesting? That the fear actually got passed on. So, when we work with people, we should never look at someone and say, well, if he's a bad kid, he's always a bad kid, that kind of thing. That they're always going to be that way, because the reality is people can change. That's the whole purpose of the gospel. I think what we need to realize is a lot of times people behave the way they do because they really, in a way, were born that way. 60% of who we are is genetics and environment. And they say about 40% is our own choices. But for your first 18 years of life, you're generally living in an environment where you're making choices that tends to agree with the environment you're living in. And by then, the pattern of your life is already set by all three of these areas. And so to actually become a believer after all that, which I did, at age 20, it's just that the power of the gospel is more powerful than those things. And then you can make new decisions. But this is why Jesus was really so emphatic with Nicodemus. Nicodemus, you had a good environment growing up. You've been around people who love to read the scriptures and tithe everything and, everything. A diet, everything. But, you still need to be born again. And I think it's just kind of coming to grips with our humanity, our fallen humanity. And this is why I like this approach, because it addresses the issue of sin. It addresses the issue that we're born with a carnal nature. And a carnal nature, nothing that's carnal will make it to heaven unless it's converted. Corruption cannot inherit incorruption. And so we need to receive from above to make it to heaven. And then we go through T for temperance, I for immunity. I think it's good to talk about the kinds of things that lessen our immunity, which is not just sugar and things like that. It's actually our thoughts. Negativity decreases our immunity. Outside for fresh air, sunshines, and then nutrition. And so I'll promise you there's not a more colorful slide than that. So we go through this. So what we're going to talk about this morning is actually intelligent design versus natural selection. Because at some point you have to address the issue that intelligent design is based on science. Okay? This is not evolution, science versus faith. This is intelligent design and faith in God versus a theory that we evolved through these mutations that were just random, okay? So God not only created the wondrous complexities of living and non-living things, but what's important is that he also made the mind capable of understanding the works of creation. And I think that's very important, that we just aren't the product of some mutations, and there just happen to be life here. The fact that we can enjoy life, the fact that we can appreciate the things of nature is important, okay? That's not something that makes any sense from randomness that we can enjoy. And what we learn is that there's this amazing bias. No one says, boy, I love it when people's, tornadoes come in and wipe out of town. Nobody says stuff like that. We have a bias towards, I'm so happy for this person that they were healed of cancer or something like that. We have a bias towards loving good things, not evil things, okay? More than that, we are able to know him through his creative works. And this is important to ask those questions or those comments, because the reality is that, when Pastor Al picked me up at the airport, we had to talk because I can't read his mind. Is that right? It's probably a good thing. And he can't read mine. But the reality is we can't read God's mind either. We're not mind readers. So for us to communicate, we either have to say something or do something. People may not always believe what you say, but they're always going to believe what you do, because that speaks louder than words. And the thing is for us to know God, he has to speak. If he never speaks, and he never created anything, I mean, that's kind of a moot point, right? We wouldn't be here. But the fact that we are created, and God has spoken to us, not just through the Word, but through the things he's made. And so when people have an approach of looking at it from the things of nature from an evolutionary viewpoint, they never get to know God that way. Because they're trying to explain everything excluding God. But imagine Adam and Eve not only seeing God face to face, but they were studying nature to learn even more about God, right? And that's what God expects us to do, is that we know him through the fact that he has spoken and he has created things and he's done things that tells us about who he is. Jesus dying on the cross tells us something about God. Jesus coming back tells us something about God, right? All these things tell us about him. And that's all part of intelligent design. And you know, when I listen to lectures about people who are trying to prove intelligent design, that's great. But it stops short of what we really need. We need people to study design to know God, not just believe that there is a God. Does that make sense? Because ultimately, the only way to get to heaven is to know God. I mean, John 17:3, this is eternal life, that they may know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom thou sent. Eternal life is not simply believing there is a God. It's to know the God behind all this wonderful design and to study design to know him better. Okay? This is a really interesting verse in Romans 1:20. For the invisible things of him, what would be some invisible things about God? It's kind of in the text, eternal power. Can you see eternal power? Okay, well, you say yes, but let's read on. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood, not by, anyway, I'll get to that, by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so they are without excuse. For example, when Jesus said to Nicodemus, come forth, we didn't see the words, we didn't see the sound waves, but we see the effect of his words. You see, that there was a demonstration of eternal power by the things he's done. And so when we look at this world, this verse is telling us to think about it. Rocks can't create rocks, and yet 99.99% of our world is non-living things. Right? The dirt, the core of the earth, all this. And you can't have living things without non-living things. You can't just have this first living cell in a vacuum. It required non-living things. And but where do all the non-living things come from? Since they can't create themselves. Somebody has to be beyond non-living things. You know, someone has to be beyond space and time, above all this. And that's what creation tells us, that there's someone that we understand the invisible things of God, his divinity, his eternal power, by the things he made, because these things can't exist unless there is someone above and beyond all these things. Does that make sense? Even when they talk about the Big Bang, they never explain where all the stuff came from before the Big Bang, right? Because they can't. Because it doesn't make sense. So intelligent design involves more than simply believing in a creator. It's about believing in his character and about believing in his laws. It's about knowing him and obeying him to find true healing, happiness, and eternal life. And that's why it's intelligent design therapy. That people will be healthier and happier if they can come to know God and his principles. And that we'll talk more about in the next message. The theory of natural selection is an attempt to explain our natural world and the universe without a creator designer. Natural selection teaches that random processes will eventually generate anything and everything if you just give it enough time. However, there are limits to randomness, and randomness cannot possibly generate a perfect world. I don't have a chart of the 118 elements in our periodic chart, but all that are non-living things. And even 118 elements, which doesn't actually sound like a lot, really, but even mathematically, wouldn't you have a limitation with 118 elements? It's not like you can get an infinity from 118 elements. They all would have to come in combinations just perfect for life, to have purpose and information to know what it's supposed to do. But these are all non-living elements to be brought together, they say. And if you just give it enough time, all these 118 elements will create anything and everything. But logically, that can't be true. There would even have to be limitations to 118 elements. Does that make sense? 99% of the human body is comprised of just 6 elements: oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, calcium, and phosphorus. That's 99% of who you are. And 85% of that last percent is 5 other elements: sulfur, potassium, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium. It doesn't, really, is that what I am? I'm just a bunch of hot air, oxygen, and magnesium and sulfur. But it is true. There are 11 elements that make up 99.85% of us. And that 0.15% of us is made up of, of about another 14 elements, just traces of it. But you realize that none of those things are living things. And they would all have to be the exact combination for every organ in your body, for every system in your body, whether it's reproductive system or, skeletal system, whatever that system is. These elements, and there's only so many of them, would all have to be in the exact proportion to have a living human being. Okay? And the possibility that you're just randomly going to put these elements together and come up with a perfectly symmetrical human being, and everything else out there that's perfectly symmetrical, is not possible. So it wasn't long, it was probably DNA they discovered more, around 1950s or somewhere in there. Is a polymer composed of 2 polynucleotide chains that coil around each other to form a double helix carrying genetic instruction for the development, functioning, growth, and reproduction of all known organisms. It's just that this DNA has to be just right. Because it's not that you have DNA to be just this mature person. The DNA has a process where you start as an embryo. And the information in this DNA is perfect for the perfect development. And also in the mother to feed the child, mother's milk. Everything is perfectly working. How does this happen? By randomness, right? Randomness. And of course, you've all been wondering about the Australian lungfish and his genome. And now you don't have to wait anymore. It is made up of 43 billion base pairs that have to be just right. But you don't have this lungfish. What are the chances of getting phosphorus and oxygen and nitrogen, all these things, to get 43 billion pairs perfectly put together? What's the chances of that? It's 0. It actually is 0. There's not 1% chance at this. And that's all they want you to say. Well, there's a possibility if you give it enough time. And the answer is no. In fact, the more time you have, and we'll get into that in a little bit, the less likely it's to happen. Okay? The more randomness you have. There are 10 major systems in the human body, namely the skeletal, muscular, nervous, endocrine, cardiovascular, lymphatic, respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive system. And the possibility of taking predominantly these 11 elements that are non-living and being randomly put together that generate perfectly functioning systems in the human body is zero. It's not going to improve over time. And this is one way of looking at that. You get a computer program, our son's a computer program, and when he puts in code, it's intelligible code. He doesn't just like, oh, no, I'm going to write code today, boom, 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 boom. It all has to make sense. He can't miss a stroke. If he misses a stroke and it's out of sequence, it won't function, or it won't do that one function. Okay? And so when you look at a computer program, which is nothing compared to the operation of the human body, nothing, not even close. But if you had a computer program, and I'm not suggesting you do this to your computer program, but if you were just to add unintelligible text, code, what happens to it? Let's just say you did it for 10 minutes. Would the program still work at least somewhat? Probably. It probably might do something. It might turn on. It might do something. But you do it again, and you just keep adding unintelligible code. You see, the more code you add, you get to the point where it will never work. It won't even turn on. You see, so when you give something enough time, and you just keep adding unintelligible code, you're not making it more likely to survive and evolve. You're making it less likely. Does that make sense? Each cell, human cell, contains approximately 3 billion base pairs. Just each cell. The DNA of a single cell contains so much information that it represents about 1.5 million pages of text. That's a lot, isn't it? And because I didn't have anything else better to do that day, I started timesing this out, right? 70 years, 365 days a year, that's over 25,000 years in 70 years. And then if you were to divide that by 1.5 million pages of text in just one cell, you'd have to read almost 60 pages a day for your entire life, most of your life, just to be able to read the information in one cell in your body. Where's the information come from? Phosphorus? Which one? Calcium? These things don't have brains. Phosphorus, nitrogen don't have a brain. They're non-living. Somebody put this all just in the right combination for every page, 1.5 million of intelligible text in a cell. There has to be a designer behind it. It's not logical that this happened randomly, okay? And then there's 30 to 40 billion or trillion cells in the human body. Just amazing. If you saw hieroglyphics on a cave wall, and you had a guy shooting a bow and arrow, and there's a deer running, whatever, would you assume that was the result of rain and wind? Natural processes? You would say there's an intelligent mind behind that, right? Well, I mean, look at the human body. We have newspapers, radio, television, the internet, whatever, and there's information, intelligent information. I'm not sure all of it's correct, but anyway, there's intelligible text. But you assume, rightly so, that behind every word is what? Is a mind. This is not random text. Someone who had intelligence had to put all these words together, okay? The information output of a machine cannot exceed the information it was programmed to perform. So an electronic printing press can print a book when all the data of that book is electronically sent to it. However, it cannot print a book for which there's no information. You know, they used to print on plates, and some small shops still do, but now it's all electronic. You have to send the text of the whole book, and then it just starts printing it off electronically. But if you don't send any text, the machine's not going to do anything. It all requires information. So does our body. Our cells won't do anything if it doesn't have information to know what it's supposed to do. There's some amazing thing. Our whole body's amazing that way. Birds can fly because anatomically they can. They possess intelligence and instincts to fly. They are pre-programmed to fly. However, evolution teaches us that birds evolved from meat-eating dinosaurs called theropods over the span of 10 million years. A theropod is the little brother of T-Rex, who would probably stand as tall as this ceiling. You know? How does this adolescent T-Rex become a bird? He can't. To become a bird would require what? Information. But there's no information in him to be a bird. Where would the information come from? God would have to design that. God would have had to say, I'm going to take theropods and turn them into birds. But it's not something you do over time. And even if you say theistic evolution, that God did it that way, why would he do it that way if he could just create the bird from the very beginning? Why would he need a theropod to have a bird 10 million years later? And of course, the problem would be us. We start off with something that crawls on the earth, something that came from the sea, and eventually start walking upright, and But the biggest problem with that is that Jesus need not have died for us. Because it's the wages of sin that's death. And if God created us already clubbing each other over the head, why hold us guilty if you made us that way? You can't hold me accountable for being a Neanderthal if you created me to be a Neanderthal. God could have only sent his son to die for us if we started off perfect and had the power of choice. Otherwise, the cross would never make sense in a theistic evolutionary world. The thing we're going to find in the next slide is that mutations do not add abilities, they discontinue them. And this was done in one of the longest studies in 1988. A Dr. Lenski had an experience. He knew he couldn't observe human beings over thousands of years because he wouldn't live that long. But he thought, bacteria has generations pretty quick, right? He could study tens of thousands of generations of E. coli, for example. So that's what he did. And so he processed over 50,000 generations of this bacteria. He would take some after year one and he'd freeze it. And then he'd change some environment with some of them, keep the other one the same. And then 10 years later, he'd freeze some of those. And then he could kind of compare them over time to see how they changed and any kind of mutations that took place. And so what they found is that by changing the environment in the test tube, the E. coli did adapt. But a creationist view is not against adaptation. Human beings, Adam and Eve had to adapt after they sinned. Things began to die. They had to adapt, and now there's thorns and thistles. They had to make a lot of adaptation. Think of the adaptation after the flood. Wow, that's a lot of adaptation. And people, wherever they went, after God confused the languages and everybody went to another part of the earth, people had to adapt to that new part of the earth that they congregated in with a common language. Adaptation. And so we have the various races of people. It was within the gene pool of Noah, no doubt. And as people congregated by themselves without airplanes and this and that and isolated from other populations of the world, there were certain genes, dominant genes that took over. And now you've got different nationalities, right? Adaptation. But what Lenski's thing is that this bacteria, the third one, Lenski's experiment did not show that bacteria gained any ability through mutations. It was just the opposite. The survivability of future bacteria was occurring as the bacteria was losing information and function. So change the environment and the bacteria does adapt, but it doesn't adapt by evolving to a more complex bacteria. It was able to survive by losing something, losing information, losing abilities. So how does an animal, see, this goes completely against the concept of evolution, where you start with simple and get more complex, but it doesn't work that way. Just look at us. We're half the height of Adam, We're adapting to a different environment. We're not evolving from Adam. He was way smarter than us. He had far greater physical, mental capacity than us. We're going down. We're not going up. Many do not accept that Adam and Eve and Noah were true historical figures that lived, like 900 years. I mean, Noah lived 600 years on the antediluvian side and then 350 years after the flood. That's a long time. Adam lived, 930 years? So you've got figures, and you say that to people, say, those weren't, come on, Jeff, you don't believe in that kind of stuff, do you? But the thing is, they do believe in some historical figures, right? Because you can't deny Abraham. I mean, he's the father of two nation groups in our world. You got the Hebrew people through Isaac, and you got the Arab people through Ishmael. They know he was a historical figure. But he lived like 4,000 years ago. Those are his dates. And these are his years. Terah, his father, lived 205 years. That's a long time. I'm 63 and I feel like an old man already. 205 years. Abraham was 138 years old when Sarah died at the age of 127. Abraham remarried and fathered other sons and daughters. And he passed away at age 175. How many guys out there are having children at 138 years old? Probably not even at 78. Abraham's son Isaac lived till he was 180 years old, and Abraham's grandson Jacob lived to 147. So if we're evolving, how is it that people live twice as long as we do today 4,000 years ago? You see, we're degenerating. And part of it is because of the accumulation of sin. Because the law of heredity does work. We are the sum total of all the sins that have ever occurred in human history. Those early generations didn't have that. They would have had a little bit. And it's just increasing through generation to generation. We live in a far more toxic world where there's over 100,000 chemicals in our soil and our air that didn't exist prior to the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. This is all things that affect our immunity. So our immunity is not nearly as strong, so we live in this toxic environment, and we're also the recipients by the law of heredity of everything wrong people have done in the past. And it's amazing to me that God's able to take this last generation, the weakest within human history, and have a group called the 144,000. But that tells you that it can't be by their strength, because they're the weakest. But they must have the greatest faith. Not just an individual here or there, but a movement of people who have embraced the three angels' messages and the principles of heaven. They look at intelligent design and they say, the smartest thing for me to do is believe in God. And to learn what are the principles of heaven, because if that's where I want to go, then I need to know what it's like to live there. What are the rules, regulations, principles that they live by? And of course, Jesus told us that. This is why Jesus, in almost most of his sermons, he would say, the kingdom of heaven is like, isn't that interesting? That he didn't talk about the principles on earth. He says the kingdom of heaven is like this. And the kingdom of heaven is like this. Because if all we do is look down here, we're going to learn a lot of bad principles. But the laws that we find in nature and the principles of heaven they're the same. And this is why our thoughts are always lifted towards heaven, which is what we ought to do. There's enough evil in the world. Have you seen enough evil already? Do you need to see more evil? Do you need to talk about more evil? It's already evil enough. We need to talk more about heaven and getting people to heaven and the principles of heaven to get people ready for heaven. We need to do that more than any people on the face of the earth. And that's our privilege as a people. Squirrels. The whole animal kingdom, except for those creepy little spiders. But outside of things like that, and sponges don't have eyes, but outside of those exceptions, everything has 2 eyes and a nose and a... God loves this. He has to love this. And 2, it's everywhere. And we were created in God's image. Okay? This world looks like you would expect it to look if there's an intelligent designer behind it, because the design's there. And it tells us what God enjoys in this design. Alrighty. And then there's over-design. And I don't mean that in a bad way. According to evolution, we would only acquire abilities that help us to survive, right? But we have more than that. The human family has many unique abilities that go beyond building a simple shelter, gathering food, and carrying a club. We were able to make up to 10,000 facial expressions with 25 unique facial muscles. If this is just survival of the fittest, do I really need to be able to do this? Do I? No. How's this make me survive as a Neanderthal? Right? It doesn't. Maybe like, you know. But I wouldn't need all those facial muscles. The fact that we have all of them tells you what? Yeah. I'm not saying all 10,000 faces are ones we should be making. But we were able to do it. I mean, you take the hand. Do I really need all this dexterity? Right? To carry a club, build a fire? And what about my feet? Do you know how amazing the foot is? The muscles, the bone structure. That I have balance. Yeah. How do you mutate balance? And it's connected to my brain for balance too, right? I've got to have all the right structure. I can walk, I can run, not as fast. I can run, I can do things. And it's just amazing. You'd say, well, how does that just happen? Because every bone in that foot has to be there for it to work right, so I don't get back pain and things like that. We're intelligently made, you know. The flagellum, have you heard of the flagellum? Probably some of you might have. This little guy's pretty interesting. He's at the end of this bacteria. And they're the ones that move this bacteria. And this is what a flagellum looks like. It's a rotor, it's a motor. Made of flesh, made of cells. It has information, but it doesn't have a brain. It doesn't think like, you know, I think I'm going to retire at age 60. You know, I'm tired of pushing around this bacteria. I think we have a union or something. You know? They just do it. They're designed to have homeostasis, the body, you know, and they move it, and this little tail here can spin up to 1,000 times per second to move this bacteria. And he knows just how to get lodged into the bacteria. And he can, on a quarter turn, go the opposite direction 1,000 times per second on a quarter turn. We don't even have motors like that. And this is living. This is made up of cells. So, you know, Darwin said if you could find something in the human body or nature that cannot be explained by mutations over long periods of time, well, there's thousands of things in the human body like that. He just didn't see it. I mean, he had a strong enough microscope to think that blood was like Jell-O or something, you know. He never knew this existed. We didn't even know about this flagellum until just 30 or so years ago, because now we can see these things. I forget what it's called, but it has like it ties a cell to, like on a chain, and he just walks. You can see the 2 feet walk. He can take 100 steps a second. He doesn't have a brain, but he knows exactly what to do. It's all information. And he follows this straight line. 2 feet. Isn't that interesting? I wish I had a clip of it. And there's no way this could exist. So you tell evolutionists about the flagellum, and they say, well, yeah, I think it just borrowed parts from other parts of the body and it turned into this. Well, the problem with that is that these parts don't exist anywhere else in the body. And this is what they call, what do they call that, huh? There's something about if you don't have all the parts, it doesn't work. And I forget the term right now. But anyway, all these parts have to be here, just like in the motor in your car. You start taking parts out of your motor, it ain't going to work. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and the Godhead, so that we are without excuse. So when we start seeing things like the flagellum, and there's other amazing things in the human body, it's like there's a factory going on. And things are moving this way, and things are moving this way, and everything knows what it's supposed to do, but none of them have their own separate brain or something like that. They just governed by this homeostasis, and they all do what they're supposed to do, and all of it requires information. And information always requires a mind behind it.
That's true.
Wherefore, if God so clothe the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is cast in the oven, shall he not much more clothe you, O ye of little faith? And if we had spent a little bit more time in nature and understanding things from a creationist viewpoint, not just to say, oh, I believe there's a God. No, it's to get to know God. Then I'd look at how he takes care of a sparrow or the grass or this, and it's like, but I'm created in his image. He must care about me. If he cares about the grass, he must care about me. And this is important for a lot of people who have mental illness. They don't feel like they're forgiven by God, or wonder why God hasn't been there in their mind or whatever. And it's like, no, they need to know that God does care. And they need to know this from this intelligent design out there that they can be reminded of every day as they drive to town or wherever, or step outside, and they see that nature really does tell me that God cares. And that everything behind every intelligent being or animal or life form, there's information. And so God's got information for me too. He doesn't have just information in my cells. He's got information for me to think about. He gave me a brain to think about information for us to live by. Does that make sense? If every cell in my body has information, the equivalent of 1.5 million pages of text, each cell, well, why wouldn't he have information for me to contemplate? Okay? And that's where the humanity really fallen. We take for granted life without thinking much about the life giver. That's a real problem with the human family. Okay? This is why God raised us up, and why we keep the Sabbath, actually, in part. God thundereth marvelously. Am I okay for time? Am I?
Yeah, a few more minutes.
2 more minutes. God thundereth marvelously with his voice. Great things doeth he, which we cannot comprehend. Is that okay? Is it okay that God did things and we don't fully understand it, but he gave us a brain to try? And over time, you'll be studying things God made for an eternity. You still won't have it all. But that's part of the beauty of being a created being. Every time you wake up, you know there's always something you can what? Learn about God, about things he's made, and be a better person, be more like him because of that day, because you took charge of it. Okay? And then the wondrous works of him which is perfect in knowledge. So he's perfect in knowledge. He knows everything. There's not anything he doesn't know. He's absolute intelligence. And this gets to an important point. There are laws of nature like the law of gravity and the laws of thermodynamics. There are God's 10 commandments. There are these laws, the laws of health. There's laws behind Bible prophecy. Laws of health down here that we talk about through the acronym New Start. And through the obedience to God's law, we receive rich benefits of health and happiness. And that's really what this seminar is. It'll be one night a week for 8 weeks. Actually, it'll probably be 10 weeks, because we'll start with design, and then the 8 letters representing 8 different lectures, and then probably end with some sort of final dinner or something for people. However, the violations of these laws leads to sadness, suffering, disease, and death. And this is why people need to know God's principles, because ultimately this is what's going to give them victory over these things. According to the Bible, the Son of God, through whom the Father created all things, put on our fallen humanity and lived among us. And why did he do this? By the transgression of our being, the human race faced eternal death. Jesus came to pay the penalty for our sins and to show us how to live in obedience to all these commandments that have been broken, right? So Jesus actually came here to protect the name of his Father, to die for our sins, but he lived in such a way in full obedience to all the principles of heaven that shows what that life looks like. What does a life look like if you obey all the principles of heaven? Oh, you heal the sick, you break down social prejudice, you reach out to people, whether it's one-on-one or in a group, whatever it is. He went about doing good. He saw life as being a servant. And we'll talk a little bit about that more this afternoon, when we talk about relationships. But Christ related to us in fulfilling the principles of heaven, showing us what that looks like. And so we've seen that slide. Let me just kind of finish up right here. Our brain weighs about 3 pounds. It's about the size of a grapefruit, has no intrinsic moving parts like the heart. It's mostly made of proteins that regulate our most basic behaviors: eating, keeping warm, sleeping, and so forth. And this is where it all starts. This is where God actually speaks to us. It's where we make all our decisions. And we'll get into more of this this afternoon. The things that... So basically, I'll just conclude with this, because the way we were designed not to break these laws. We weren't designed to be stationary, not get enough sleep, or do things like smoking and so forth. We weren't designed for that. And because of these things and practicing these things, we see that there's an ill effect. There's damage that we do to ourselves because these do not agree with the principles of heaven. And so this is why when God raised up the Seventh-day Adventist Church, he didn't just tell us to keep the 10 Commandments. He did tell us to do that, but he told us to keep other things too, right? Because these are all principles of heaven. It's not a way of earning salvation. It's a way of being healthier and happier and getting to know your Creator better, which is what prepares you for heaven.